First look at newly released body camera video showing police responding to the home of actor Gene Hackman.
Gene Hackman.
Gene Hackman.
Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman.
In March 2026, reports began circulating that the FBI had raided the Santa Fe estate of Gene Hackman. What investigators reportedly found nearly 340 feet underground raised questions that still haven't been fully answered. But that wasn't the part that made people pay attention. Within 48 hours, similar underground structures were identified in other locations across the United States, different properties, different owners, but the same design. And when those locations were mapped, a pattern began to emerge, a network tied to people with influence, resources, and access to things most people never see. And according to fragments of communications linked to these properties, whatever this network is, it's not just collecting something, it's preparing for something. At first, yet the story didn't seem like it would go anywhere. A report about a raid. No official confirmation beyond a controlled statement. No detailed explanation. Just enough information to exist, but not enough to be understood. The Federal Bureau of Investigation described the situation in the simplest possible terms. A property had been inspected. No illegal materials were found. No charges were filed. Normally, that would be the end of it. But this time, it wasn't, because details started appearing from outside official channels, not all at once and not from one place. Small pieces scattered across different sources, aerial footage showing activity at the property, mentions of heavy equipment being moved in and out, observations from people nearby who described something unusual about the structure itself. And then one detail that kept repeating, the depth. Multiple independent accounts described a passageway descending nearly 340 feet below ground level. That immediately changes the context. A standard basement doesn't go that deep. Even large private bunkers rarely reach that level unless they are designed for something specific. At that depth, construction becomes expensive, complex, and intentional. You don't build that by accident. You build it because you need separation from the surface, from the weather, visibility, and from interference. And when investigators began looking at what existed inside that space, the questions multiplied. The underground structure wasn't empty, it wasn't incomplete, it was fully operational. Reports described a controlled internal environment, systems regulating temperature and humidity with precision, water filtration setups capable of supporting long-term use, sections of reinforced construction that suggested a purpose beyond comfort. And then there was the collection. Not decoration, not random storage, a library, but not the kind you would expect to find in a private residence. Descriptions reference rare texts, historical documents, and materials focused on subjects that don't usually appear together in a single place. Ancient civilizations, astronomical records, early scientific theories, religious manuscripts from multiple traditions. This wasn't casual interest. It was curated, organized, built over time, and it raised a question that didn't have an easy answer. Why would someone need to preserve this kind of information underground? The situation might have remained isolated, just another unexplained story if it had stopped there, but it didn't. Within 2 days, another location surfaced, different states, different owner, but the same general structure, underground construction, isolated systems, unusual collections, then another and another. By the end of the week, the number had grown beyond coincidence. 14 locations across multiple states. Each one shared characteristics that were too specific to ignore. Similar depth ranges, similar environmental systems, similar patterns in how the structures were concealed within the properties. Different people, same idea. At that point, the question changed. It was no longer about what had been found in one place. It became about how many places existed and how long they had been there. Because structures like that don't appear overnight. They require planning, resources, coordination, permits, or ways around them. They require people who know how to build them and people who know how to keep them unnoticed. And most importantly, they require a reason. When analysts began mapping the locations, something else became clear. They weren't randomly distributed. They formed clusters. regions where multiple properties existed within relatively close distance of each other, areas where connections between owners, business, financial, or social could be traced. And when those connections were followed, the pattern became harder to dismiss because these weren't isolated individuals acting independently. They were linked, not always directly, not always publicly, but consistently, enough to suggest coordination, enough to suggest intention. And once that possibility entered the picture, everything else started to look different. The underground structures, the collections, the silence. It stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like a system. By the time the fourth location surfaced, it stopped looking like a coincidence. 14 underground structures spread across multiple states, built with the same intent, hidden in similar ways, and connected through people who, on the surface, shouldn't have been connected at all. That's when investigators stopped asking what was being built and started asking who was building it. Once the locations were mapped, the connections began to reveal themselves slowly, not in obvious ways, not through public statements or direct acknowledgments, through patterns. Property ownership records were the first layer. Many of the estates were registered under different names: private individuals, holding companies, trusts. On paper, they appeared unrelated. But when those records were expanded, when ownership chains were traced further back, similarities began to appear. Shell companies linked to the same legal firms, financial transactions routed through the same institutions, construction permits approved through overlapping networks of contractors and consultants. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it suggested coordination. The next layer came from communication data. Only fragments were available, and most of it had already been filtered or restricted. But even within those fragments, certain patterns stood out. Repeated contact between individuals connected to different properties. Such messages that appeared routine on the surface, but contained phrasing that didn't quite fit ordinary conversation. References to sites, expansions, and transfers without clear context. At first, these could be dismissed as coincidence, business discussions, private projects, unrelated ventures, but then the language became more specific. The network is stable, new locations secured, materials transferred successfully. The wording suggested something organized, something structured, and something that extended beyond a single location. It wasn't one property being developed, it was multiple, at the same time, with shared objectives. That raised a different kind of question. Not just what these structures were, but what they were meant to do together. Because one underground facility can serve a purpose on its own. 14 that are spread across different states, connected through overlapping networks of people and resources, that suggests something else entirely, a system, and systems are built with intent. The next major shift came from what was found inside these locations. Early reports had already mentioned collections, libraries of rare texts, historical documents, and materials that didn't typically appear in private archives. But as more information surfaced, the scale became clearer. These weren't small collections, they were extensive, thousands of volumes, carefully preserved, categorized, expanded over time, and focused on very specific themes. Ancient civilizations appeared repeatedly, not just in general historical texts, but in detailed studies. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, early Mesopotamian records, and structures that don't fit easily into standard timelines. Astronomical records formed another major category, not modern astronomy, but historical observations. Star alignments, cyclical patterns, references to events recorded long before modern instruments existed. Religious and philosophical texts were also heavily represented, but not the commonly circulated versions. Rare translations, alternative interpretations, documents that had either been removed from mainstream circulation or had never been widely distributed to begin with. And then there were materials that didn't fit into any one category. Technical documents, notes, diagrams, references to systems and concepts that were difficult to place within known frameworks. Taken together, the collections didn't look random, they looked intentional, as if they were assembling something, not just preserving knowledge, organizing it, and that led to one of the most significant discoveries: a document, partially recovered, not fully released, but referenced in multiple independent accounts. It wasn't long and it wasn't detailed, but it contained something that hadn't appeared anywhere else before. A list, names, dozens of them. Some are identifiable, some not. Individuals connected to different industries: entertainment, finance, technology, government, people with influence, resources, access. The document itself didn't explain what the list represented, but its context made one thing clear: these weren't random names. They were connected to the network, whether as members, contributors, or something else wasn't immediately clear, but they were part of it. And that changed the scale of the situation entirely, because this was no longer about properties or structures or even collections. It was about people, a group, coordinated whether formally or informally, working towards something that hadn't been explained publicly. And once that possibility was established, the remaining question became unavoidable. Why? Why build something like this? Why collect this kind of material? Why connect across multiple states, multiple industries, and multiple layers of ownership? Because projects at this scale don't exist without purpose. They require planning, time, resources, and above all, intention. When investigators looked at the design of the facilities themselves, another detail stood out. They weren't just built for storage, they were built for survival. With climate control systems capable of long-term operation, water filtration setups designed for independence, energy systems that could function without external support. In some locations, evidence of food storage capacity. In others, communication systems that were isolated from standard networks. These were not temporary spaces. They were self-contained, designed to operate without reliance on the outside world. And that suggests something very specific: preparation, not for convenience, not for privacy, but for continuity, for maintaining something over time, even if conditions outside change. And when that idea is placed next to everything else, the network, the collections, the coordination, it leads to a conclusion that is difficult to ignore. These structures were not built randomly. They were built with a shared objective. And whatever that objective is, it hasn't been explained. At that point, one detail started appearing again and again, not in headlines, not in official reports, but in fragments of communication tied to the network. A year, 2031. And the more that number appeared, the harder it became to ignore. By the time the network had been mapped and the purpose of the structures began to take shape, investigators were no longer just looking at what existed. They were looking at what it pointed toward. Because building a system like this across multiple states, involving multiple individuals, requiring long-term planning and coordination, only makes sense if it's preparing for something that hasn't happened yet. The facilities themselves already suggested that. They weren't temporary, they weren't experimental. They were designed for continuity, for functioning independently from the world above. And when fragments of communication were analyzed more closely, a pattern began to emerge. Certain phrases repeated across different sources. The timeline is shifting. Expansion needs to accelerate. Windows are closing. On their own, those phrases could mean anything, but then came the detail that connected them. References to a specific year, 2031. At first, it appeared in isolated mentions, a number without context, something that could easily be dismissed, but it didn't stay isolated. It showed up again and again, across different communications, across different individuals, always in similar contexts, not as speculation, as a marker, a point in time that something was moving toward. And that raises a difficult question. What happens in 2031? There is no single answer, and no confirmed event, no official explanation. But when the materials collected within the network are examined alongside those references, a pattern begins to form. Many of the texts focus on cycles, astronomical cycles, historical cycles, patterns that repeat over long periods of time. Some of these patterns are well understood, others are not. Ancient records often describe alignments, transitions, and periods of change, moments when conditions shift in ways that affect entire civilizations. In most cases, these descriptions are treated as symbolic or mythological. But within these collections, they are treated differently, as data, as something to be studied, compared, and understood. And when those patterns are projected forward, certain dates begin to stand out. 2031 is one of them. That doesn't mean something specific is guaranteed to happen, but it does suggest that within this network, it has been identified as significant enough to prepare for, and that preparation is visible in the design of the facilities. Because if the goal were simply to preserve knowledge, there would be easier ways to do it. Digital storage, distributed archives, public institutions, but this network didn't choose those options. It chose physical preservation, underground, isolated, protected. That choice matters. It suggests a concern that digital systems may not be reliable, that surface level infrastructure may not be stable, that whatever is being prepared for could affect access to information, communication, or even the ability to operate in normal conditions. And when that possibility is considered, the design of the system makes more sense. Multiple locations, redundancy, distributed storage. If one site fails, others remain. If one region is affected, others continue. It's not just a collection. It's a network designed to endure disruption. And that leads to a broader implication. If a group of individuals with access to resources, information, and influence are preparing for something at this scale, it suggests they believe the risk is real, not theoretical, not distant, something within a time frame that justifies action now. Because building these structures takes years, acquiring these materials takes decades, coordinating across multiple locations requires sustained effort. This isn't a reaction, it's a long-term strategy. And that raises the final question: what do they know? Not in the sense of secret information hidden behind a single discovery, but in the sense of pattern recognition, data that isn't widely available, access to models, projections, or interpretations that lead to a different conclusion than the one most people are working with. Because throughout history, groups have always prepared based on what they believed was coming. Sometimes they were wrong, sometimes they weren't, but the scale of this preparation is what makes it different. This isn't a single individual building a private bunker. It's a coordinated system, spread across states, connected through people, focused on preserving specific categories of knowledge, and aligned, at least in part, around a shared timeline. 2031. The official position remains unchanged. No confirmed statements, no charges, no detailed explanation of what was found or why these structures exist. But the properties continue to be monitored. Construction activity in some areas continues quietly, and communication between individuals connected to the network has not stopped. It has adapted, more secure, less visible, more difficult to trace, which suggests that whatever this is, it isn't finished, it's ongoing. And that leaves everything exactly where it started, with a question that still hasn't been answered. Not about one property, not about one individual, but about the system as a whole, a network that exists, a pattern that repeats, a timeline that points forward, and a purpose that hasn't been explained. Because if this is preparation, then preparation for what? And why is it happening quietly? While everything on the surface appears normal, the structures are still there, the collections are still growing, the connection still exists, and whatever this network is preparing for, it hasn't happened yet.